Okay, everybody, it wouldn't be a virtual engagement webinar without some severe technical difficulties to get started. So thanks for your patience here. We're going to go ahead and get started now on this webinar discussing virtual engagement, meeting and setting measurable goals. This webinar is co-sponsored by the APA Colorado chapter, so thank you so much to APA Colorado, and thanks everyone for being here today. There is a questions option in GoToWebinar. I personally am a little unfamiliar with this platform, so please bear with me. I think you can submit questions and comments as we go along. I'd love for this to be a little bit interactive and less me just droning on and on about this topic. So if you have questions, please just pop them into that question section and I will try to get to them as we go along. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get rolling on this exciting content. So I'm a little bit of a masochist on public engagement. I think this year was a really a test for everybody on how much you actually like public engagement. This has sort of been a forced experiment on moving everything that we traditionally did in person to a virtual setting. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about why community engagement is important and why virtual engagement is actually beneficial to the overall planning process. We'll walk through some components of creating a virtual engagement framework, setting and achieving measurable goals, choosing the right tools, asking the right questions, battling burnout, your communities and your own, and then documenting achievement and hopefully celebrating a great community engagement process at the end. So first, why and why now? I get this question all the time. You know, why do we have to do community engagement? Why is it important to the planning process? And I always think of this story I heard actually when I was listening to a podcast. I'm one of those people who always references podcasts. This podcast was on Planet Money. And it's a story about the community of Bend, Oregon. And Bend, Oregon was going through a transportation planning effort where they were really trying to increase connectivity between the east and west parts of their community, which is bifurcated by a heavy rail line. And when they were thinking about how to advertise the community engagement process and get the community excited about this transportation planning process, they created this billboard that had a covered wagon on it. And they had this funny, catchphrase, is traveling east to west still tough, because the heavy rail line bifurcated their community in half from east to west. Take this survey. Now, the planners, when they were thinking about this covered wagon, they were thinking that, it was a cute symbol showing Americans' journey from the East Coast to the West Coast. But for many of the indigenous community in Bend and in the surrounding areas, this was really an image that connoted violence for them. And so the transportation planning effort, instead of starting with excitement and momentum, it really started with this feeling that big swaths of the community were being left out of even the infancy stages of the process. So that's why community engagement is essential. It really encourages us to start with each other instead of starting with ourselves. Those planners were working from their specific experiences, their perceptions, their backgrounds, rather than working from the collective experiences of the community as a whole. We often hear about why virtual engagement is bad. We love the energy and the excitement that we get out of being in a room full of people, but actually, we've come to realize that virtual engagement has a ton of benefits for excellent planning work. Namely, I'm going to go through a couple, major benefits that we've seen from virtual engagement. Firstly, we can reach more people. As an example, we launched a digital hub, so a project website for a project that we were working on, and within 30 days, we already had reached 20 times the amount of people that we would in a traditional open house. So really, the broad reach that you can achieve with virtual engagement is much greater than a traditional planning process. You can reach different people. So typically, I don't know if this is your experience, but it's certainly mine, that the same people tend to come to community engagement meetings, tend to come to the same public open houses. But with virtual engagement, you're really able to reach areas and parts of the community that don't typically engage with civic planning work. You can also expand accessibility. So with traditional engagement, that in-person component is required. So in a virtual setting, you can really expand access to people who typically cannot participate in public engagement processes. You can create layered options. So again, in a traditional public engagement process, the requirement is still that you're there in person. You can offer different activities, you can offer different ways to collaborate, but the time commitment is still required of that person to come to the place and engage in that way. But with virtual engagement, you can reach people in the ways that they want to engage. So you can have people just learn a little bit about the project. Maybe they have 1 minute to take a poll. Maybe they have 5 minutes to take a survey, or maybe they have a whole hour to come to a virtual meeting. And finally, you can use the really modernized advantages of the digital space to collect data on your audience and then tweak your virtual engagement strategy over time to use that data to your advantage. So let's talk a little bit about building a virtual engagement framework. So it's so often Groundhog's Day with public engagement scopes. You know, you have your community survey, and then you have 2 to 3 open houses, and then maybe you have a little event booth or something, and then you print out all your attendance sheets and your minutes, and then you staple them to the appendix of your plan, and you're done with community engagement. But I want to kind of ask us to question that a little bit and have us step back a little bit and talk about really when we're thinking about building a virtual engagement framework and a public engagement framework in general, what level of influence does the community have over the overall outcomes of this planning process? So it's great to have community engagement, and community engagement is of course very important to our planning work, but it's really disingenuous, and it can in fact be damaging to have this really heavily emphasized quantitatively based community engagement process when actually the level of influence that your community has is quite minimal. So I would start here with determining what the level of influence is that your community has over your planning process. So let's say that you're implementing a recommendation, you have an initiative to implement a recommendation from a comp plan where there's already been a very robust community engagement process. You know the direction that the community wants to go. You might focus solely on transparent communication. So this is really in cases where, again, there's already been a robust community engagement process. You're implementing something with a lot of buy-in from the community already, and the impact on the community is minimal or already deeply understood. So in this case, you're really focusing on creating strong communication, clearly communicating outcomes, so your community understands what's going on, and maybe you do some light touch engagement around ways to make the implementation process smoother. The second level of influence is active listening. So this is maybe there are 1 or 2 options that clearly articulate or achieve the broad goals that the community has already weighed in on. There's low impact to the community, so you want to listen to concerns and you want to use those concerns in evaluating the options that you have at the table, but you're not really taking action on things that the community is telling you. The third stage is action listening. So this is a case where, you know, maybe you are implementing something from a broad and robust community engagement process that has happened previously, but you're weighing options, and maybe the impact is considered greater on the community, or there are certain parts within the community there that are expected to be more greatly impacted by the initiative that you're implementing. So in this case, you want to listen to concerns and really take action on those concerns to influence how you're going to implement, what options you're going to select. And the final level of influence is really you're creating a shared vision together. So this is where the community is really a collaborative partner in the planning process. And I want to get us away from this feeling of meritocracy that planners should, you know, just collect data, create options, and then create an implementation and action plan for those options. This really uses the community knowledge to create a shared vision for the goals and principles, the solutions, the options, and then a shared implementation and action plan ultimately. So the second part of building a successful engagement effort is really, again, deeply understanding that community role. So asking the question, what is the community helping the organization achieve? And you might have a planning process where the community is helping you achieve or understand all three of these components. So the problem, the solutions, and the implementation process. But it's really important in order to determine what questions to ask, how to engage the community. You really want to understand what role they're playing in the planning process. So are they helping you articulate the problem and understand the scope of the problem, its causes, its impacts? Do you already understand the problem? They don't need to help you articulate it, and they're helping you understand how to solve the problem? Or do you understand the problem and the solutions, and you're really asking the community to tell you what barriers there are to implementation, how certain initiatives might be received by the community, what level of support they have for different initiatives that you're trying to implement? And again, you might be at these stages at different during different time frames during your planning process. At the beginning, they might be helping you articulate the problem. At the end, they might be helping you solve the implementation process. But it's really important to understand where the community is really providing value. And I've learned the most in this regard from mistakes that my team has made in creating a robust community engagement process where we're really asking the community to help us in the wrong areas. I'm thinking of specifically a project that we did out in Dallas where we were helping to implement a community vision that had already been clearly articulated. So the problem that they articulated was they had this aging parking structure that was serving a retail development, a mixed-use development that the community had access to, and it was a publicly owned structure. And the community had a vision that they wanted the site to provide parking, but they also wanted it to provide some other community benefit. They wanted it to provide a park, and they wanted an enhanced pedestrian and mobility environment and various amenities. But we spent all this time at the beginning of the community engagement process asking the community user satisfaction questions around use of the existing parking structure, when we really already knew that the parking structure would no longer be there. We already knew it was failing to help the community or to solve for their problems. We already, in fact, knew that the structural integrity of the structure was compromised. So we really should have been focusing on what solutions were applicable to solve the problem that we had identified, and possibly even already the implementation process. So kind of asking these seemingly simple questions at the beginning of your framework can really help you land on appropriate questions for your community members. Finally, I think any community engagement conversation needs to have some questioning of equity and an understanding of equity. So we typically love to have a little bit of a conversation about the difference between equal versus equitable. So an equal community engagement process is the same in quantity, size, and value. So you're really providing the same opportunities of engagement, the same level of influence for everybody in your community. Certainly a reasonable and a valuable goal to want to achieve. But if you think about the impacts that your planning process will have on your community, and there are in fact going to be communities that are more significantly impacted by the outcomes than others, then a truly equitable process is giving those people more of a voice at the table. And I want to just have us think a little bit about the ways in which this manifests itself in the community engagement process. We so frequently give more voice at the table to those who tend to not be as impacted by some of the changes that we're making. Working in the parking and mobility and transportation space, I frequently work with communities that we're talking about parking pricing, for example. They always want to go to the business and property owners and talk to them first and give them more of a role in the planning process, when in fact, it's the hourly employees, it's the service workers, it's the domestic workers, it's low-income folks in the community who are going to be more significantly impacted by the planning work that we're doing. So one way that I think that manifests itself is the selection of stakeholder groups, quote unquote stakeholder groups, and the naming of stakeholder groups. So in some of my communities, we've in fact started to shy away from the term quote unquote stakeholders and calling them something else, calling them allies, calling them connectors, calling them just community members who are helping us complete a task with this planning process. So you start to shift the language of allowing for people who tend to have outsized influence in planning processes as being stakeholders, to really reshifting the focus to allowing for folks who are going to be more significantly impacted by the planning process to have more of that voice. So talking about setting measurable goals, I wanted to focus on two main issues that we like to set goals on when we're thinking about virtual engagement processes. The first kind of ties into that equality versus equity issue, understanding and leveraging untapped and heavily impacted communities. So in many of our virtual engagement processes in the last couple of years, we've specifically tried to set measurable goals around how our community engagement process is able to leverage the knowledge, the backgrounds, the experience, the feedback of community groups that are typically untapped and even marginalized or ignored historically in planning processes. So this example, this puzzle piece example, is some work that we did with the city of Boulder to specifically identify and name the groups that are historically untapped and we're going to be more substantially impacted by this planning process than the general public or other groups within the community. So we specifically named those groups. And then, we wanted to, and I highly recommend creating a quantitative goal around how you're able to engage with these groups, in addition to just, qualitatively understanding who they are, engaging them. So the first step is really naming them and understanding who they are and who they're representing. And then, you want to look at what the way that we've done it in the past is we look at the demographics of that community, the broad demographics, and how these groups fit into the broad demographics. And then we actively measure the demographics of our collaborators over the course of the virtual engagement process. And if we find that, we're not hearing from these groups as much as we want to, then we can specifically tailor our engagement effort. Maybe we're tailoring our social media, maybe we're engaging with community groups that have a following among these groups to get the word out, so we can improve our demographics there. And it really helps you tell a good story, and also helps you guarantee and have some sort of quantitative demonstration that you were able to engage with these communities. So this is a little pop-up survey that we have actually on our digital hub for the city of Boulder, wherever you are on the website, if you're a first-time visitor, this pops up. You can X out, but it does, we have a pretty high percentage of those who are engaging with this pop-up survey compared to total website visitation numbers. And it just helps us understand our collaborators and our community a bit more. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about transparency. So transparency is a hugely important goal in any community engagement process. The first kind of component of transparency is making sure that all of your documentation, everything that you have in the public realm, is accessible for all, regardless of background, meaning socioeconomic background, physical and cognitive disability, education, etc. So we've had a lot of success with actually having certain members of the community, especially if like English is their second language, that maybe they're in the service sector, they're low income, they're unhoused. We actually have them review the materials that we're putting out, like our one-pagers, like our infographics, our executive summaries. Can they understand it? Do they know what we're talking about? It's hugely important if you are truly doing a community engagement process intended to reach the entirety of your community. It really has to be legible and digestible for the entirety of your community. And sometimes as planners, many of us are well educated, many of us have post-baccalaureate degrees. We sometimes are not the best judge of that. So writing, trying to aim for a 5th to 8th grade reading level, and then having other people read it and review it is hugely important. Being honest about community influence on the project, we talked about that. And then again, process transparency, especially when money is involved. So being involved in parking and transportation, we're frequently involved in user fee increases, and many of our communities, they increase the user fees, but then they never tell the community where the revenue is going, even if it's going to places that are mutually beneficial for the entire community. So I love this infographic here. This is not my example, I did not make this, and I might have personal qualms with where New York City chooses to spend its tax dollars. But I love this example because it clearly shows in legible terms where your tax dollars are going. And they have, in fact, a calculator that you can use where you can put how many what you paid in property taxes in a certain year, and it tells you in what dollar amount where your money went. It's available in different languages. So this is a great example of how you can use transparency to establish mutual benefit with your community and show your community that you're working for them. So choosing the right tools, there's so many tools out there, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time like going through each and every tool. I'm sure many of you have great experiences with different tools out there, and everyone has different preferences. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the principles that we bring to achieving different components of the community engagement plan, and then what tool, an example of one key tool that has worked for us. So for broad impact, this is like trying to get the word out, trying to get as many people involved in the process as possible, which is really important, especially at the beginning of an engagement process. Your principles behind broad impact is you want to have layered options. So you want to have different ways for people to engage and learn about the project. You want to maximize accessibility. So you want to make sure everything you put out there is legible to everybody in your community, not just people at the same education level and background as you. And you really want to maximize reach. So this is kind of the throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks part of the community engagement process, where you're on social media, you're in person, you're putting out flyers, you're doing everything you can to get the word out. So what we've seen worked from a broad impact perspective, and I really love that this is really becoming important in many planning processes, it's creating a project website or a digital hub for the project. And I'm not talking like your typical boring project web page where it's the name of the project and a little schedule and like some contact information. This is really the center of community engagement for your project. And there are some great companies that do this. I'm gonna walk through some of my favorites here in this presentation. Social media engagement, hugely important. And then your community itself. So leveraging organizations that are already working with the community to get the word out, like your Downtown Chamber of Commerce, your local NAACP chapter, your local Center for People with Disabilities. Really leverage some of those organizations. Bicycle Colorado is another one that we work with all the time. Like really leverage those organizations that are already getting traction from the community members that you're trying to reach. Leverage their networks, ask them for help. So some examples here, like this digital hub concept is hugely customizable, and some companies out there are doing amazing work getting the word out for that. We work with Bang the Table very frequently on building project websites, and I love them because it's a simple dashboard, super simple platform. You can self-build, you can customize, and it really focuses on calls to action for your community. So when your community comes to your project website, they immediately get an understanding of what they're supposed to be doing and the ways in which they can engage with the website. So these are examples for Texas A&M and then Clallam Transit in Clallam County, Washington. Hugely diverse tool. And then this was another example. We worked with a local company, Denver Crowd, using their platform Podium to develop a fully customized website for the city of Boulder for some transportation planning work that we're doing there. And it was really important to us to really create a custom build here, but I love that these have really the same principles, these calls to action, the layered options, the ways, I can engage if I have like 30 seconds, if I just want to know, oh, okay, they're doing a revitalizing access project. Okay, I have 1 minute, I have five minutes, I want to have more of a discussion with my community. It's so apparent to people how they can engage in the ways that they want to right from the get when they get to the website. So talking a little bit about community meetings. So the principles here, I am not a fan of open mic nights for community meetings. I think every community meeting should have really clear structure. I really love some really clear structure for community meetings. Layered options, again, like I think it's really important to give people, when they're coming to the meeting, the option to leave early, maybe engage in some smaller ways if they can't stay the whole time. And then making sure that you have equal accessibility. So maintaining those accessibility principles, closed captioning, some ADA considerations, sign language interpretation, interpretation for languages as appropriate for a community, all hugely important. And if you can't offer all of those for a community meeting, you need to have, you know, alternative ways for those people to engage in the same robust way. So some tools that have been really helpful for us for community meetings. Breakout groups, so having people work together in breakout groups during community meetings, polling like Mentimeter, digital blackboards like Mural. And then what I'm going to walk through here is some imagination and visualization, so some scenario-based tools to use during community meetings. One thing I love to do during community meetings, and we've had a lot of success doing this, is getting people out of their own experience. So frequently, communities want to have an open house where they just, you know, set up a mic and have people share their grievances, but it really results in a lack of productivity. And I know that sometimes you have to let people vent and you have to just actively listen. But if you want to be able to continue to draw the clear line between the feedback you're getting and the ultimate outcomes in your planning process, it's really important to get people outside of themselves and start to give you some valuable feedback around the scenarios and options that you're specifically examining. So this is an example where we were looking at a neighborhood parking permit program, specifically a commuter parking program. We actually have people in community meetings imagine they were this person and they were doing this thing and they had these conditions, and give us some options that they thought should be available to that person. It's a really fun activity for people. And in this case, we did kind of the same thing. We were doing some pricing work, and we had people pretend to be superheroes, actually, with different perspectives. In this example, the people in this group were the city's economy superheroes. So they were trying to develop a pricing approach from the perspective of someone who is passionate about helping the city community create a diverse and thriving economy. So that might not have been their personal perspective, but it's really interesting to get people outside themselves and kind of see how they behave in these certain scenarios, and then you can clearly use the feedback that they give you to help inform scenarios and derive outcomes. So in small groups, small group principles, productivity. So again, small groups tend to get into venting sessions. We definitely want to create meetings that are super productive and continue to support that clear line between feedback and outcomes. We want to maximize impact that the group has on influencing project outcomes. And we also want to make sure that the questions that we're asking are appropriate for the group. Some things that we've had be successful in small group meetings include guided questions, polling like Mentimeter, digital blackboards like Mural, and then just active listening. And in fact, small groups are great if you can get them to hear each other too. We love, polling people from different perspectives, maybe an environmental group, maybe the Downtown Chamber of Commerce, maybe the local university, get them all in the same room and get them to hear each other and hear each other's perspectives. It can be really transformational. So an example of how we've engaged small groups, we love to use Mentimeter, not as like really a polling or consensus building tool, but as a discussion tool for small groups. So asking some questions on Mentimeter, you can ask more complex questions. I love Mentimeter because it shows some immediate data analytics around how people are responding to this question. You can see the question distribution here, you can see the averages here, and then using that as a discussion tool to open up the conversation and let people hear each other explain their perspective and see why they landed the way they did. So asking the right questions, a colleague of mine asked me if I could address the rumor mill, and I love the perspective of kind of like turning the rumor mill into a windmill. So I like to think of rumors as demonstrating excitement about a topic or interest in a topic. Typically, people aren't spreading rumors about a topic that they're not interested in or they don't find important to their lives. So harnessing those rumors can be really impactful. We've actually had a lot of success with doing social media live, so Facebook or Instagram live, so people can share their questions in real time and you can answer their questions. Obviously, you know, that can get dangerous if it's a really controversial topic, but I think it's really great to invite some of that back and forth engagement with your community. We've also had a lot of success with targeted invitations to participate and not accepting the participation final count if it's well below your goal and you know that people are talking about this issue. So as an example, we worked with a community where we had this survey out and we knew that people were interested in this topic, but no one was answering any of our survey questions. We weren't really getting a lot of traction. Meanwhile, there was this guy who had a blog and he was just writing terrible things about the work we were doing and creating all these kinds of, you know, flying all these kinds of false flags around the outcomes of the project and the direction that we were going. So we actually, you know, contacted him and we were able to form kind of a mutually beneficial relationship with him where he was actually able to get people using his blog, which everyone was visiting, to participate in our survey. So if you know that people are, you know, actively talking about this project and the work that you're doing, but your participation count is low, like really leverage some of the folks in your community who are leading those conversations, even if it's scary and you are getting a lot of angry reacts. The other thing to do is, you know, again, transparency about influence. And I know I keep saying this, but it's so important to be really transparent about the actual influence your community has over outcomes. Having a frequently asked questions section on your website, if you have a project digital hub, is super important. And getting decision makers involved early and often. You know, a lot of times I've been to city council meetings where the city council members were getting letters and angry emails and phone calls about our project for a long time, and they were like, well, why don't we know about this? So getting decision makers early, getting them to be champions of the project often, getting them to be effective speakers on the project and the project outcomes is really, really important. So talking a little bit about project startup, the foundation of the project, you really want to ask some foundational questions around building a shared vision of success and kind of alleviating some of the fears about the project, maybe learning what some of those fears are. This is an exercise that we love to do on Mural during kickoff meetings and small group meetings. Like, what does success look like to you? What factors do you use in your decision making about this issue? Your fears, how do you think we could work together to harness these fears? Those kinds of foundational questions that really help to start to create and build a shared vision of success. Project milestones, so when you're starting to create some options for where your project is heading, you might want to ask some directional questions that will help steer the project toward a solution that will work. So this is an example actually from SurveyMonkey. We specifically asked, you know, if there were this fee, how would it change how you use this this amenity, this option? So you want to kind of understand from your community, how would this solution change your behaviors? What benefits do you see? What issues or challenges do you see with this solution? So you're kind of clearly getting from the community some general boundaries, some guardrails, some direction on where you should head next. And finally, when you get to project outcomes and you start to solidify the direction that you're going, then you want to start building consensus. So this is where you're asking questions that measure or affirm the supportive solutions, or you're maybe building some momentum around an option that you're planning to implement. So what else would help the solution be successful? So this is a example on Mentimeter where we knew we were redeveloping this park and ride system. We know that we're going to create these urban high density park and rides. So instead of asking them, hey, do you like this idea? Or what goals do you have around the park and ride system? We were asking consensus and momentum building questions, like what amenities would help us achieve this implementation strategy that we've already landed on. So again, being really clear about the level of influence the community has at each stage in the process. So battling burnout is a really important topic and something that I really wanted to talk a little bit about here. So a great example of this, we are working with the city of Boulder currently. We had this great idea. We were building our virtual engagement plan to have this virtual community workshop series, and there would be different modules at different times. People could choose what times they could come, and it was all on Zoom. We, advertised the heck out of this engagement series. We did everything we could to get people to come. We did push notifications through their parking payment app. We did social media. We did flyers. We did business cards. We had everybody and their brother posting on social media. We had 11 signups ultimately. So instead of saying, instead of soldiering on and saying, well, that was our plan, let's just go through with it, we decided to switch gears really significantly, and we listened to the community. We heard them say, we don't want to go to more virtual meetings. We don't want any more virtual meetings on our schedules. So instead, we built these modules from the work that we'd already done, the planning work that we'd already put into the virtual community workshop series, and we created these 15 and 30-minute modules that could easily be tacked onto meetings that people in the community already had. So that was an example of us listening, paying attention to cues, and then we also leveraged community organizations that already had meetings on the schedule, already had people coming to their meetings, it was already on their calendars, and then we just used that rather than having this whole other virtual community workshop series when people were telling us they didn't want that. And then the other thing I'll say that, I hear a lot from communities that are going through planning work. We always plan, we never do anything. So know the value of a simple and visible implementation project. Some great examples are some of the shared streets conversions that we've seen during COVID. I know communities are doing a ton of planning work, long-term planning work related to COVID and just generally in their communities. But just little tweaks and changes to the physical, built environment that people experience every day can be hugely impactful to show people that you're doing something with that planning effort. You also will get burnt out, not just your community. So it's really important to understand that you're going to get burnt out. Virtual engagement can be exhausting. You are not getting the same energy that you're getting when you're in a big room of people and you can just go and go and go and you're hearing and listening to other people speak around you. It is exhausting staring into a screen all day. So it can be helpful in your internal meetings about the project, understand like not everything needs to be a meeting and not every meeting needs to be on video. I can't tell you how many friends I've made just by when I start meetings, I say, do you guys want to have our videos on? Or I've actually been on video all day. I'm feeling, under the weather. I'm feeling like I don't really want to have my video on. Let's all turn our videos off. People really appreciate that, and it really gives you time to recharge a little bit. Understanding and clearly articulating your why is also really important. Again, we love community engagement as planners. Like all of us, I'm sure, think it's really important. But understand why you're engaging the community and how that can help kind of maintain your team's energy and your energy over time. And then finally, battling elected and appointed official burnout. This is such an important consideration right now because so frequently, especially if you're working in a part of the planning space that isn't, immediately related to COVID or equity concerns, there's a ton of questions around why are we doing this now when we have so many other more important things on our plates. So make sure that you're tying your work in with the broader purpose, with the broader goals of the community, and with the issues of the moment if you can, and clearly articulate how you're addressing those equity issues, how you're addressing COVID, and all the things that are top of mind for your elected and appointed officials. And clearly understand and articulate for your team and for the people that you're working with, the framework each of your elected and appointed bodies are operating under. If you're going to them with something that isn't clearly related to their directives under your city charter, it's really important to articulate to them why you're coming to them and have a clear ask for them. Finally, the exciting part of documenting achievement. So it's really important to document like how you met the goals that you set, and B, celebrate at the end of the planning process. And this all, the point of community engagement is, for me, is to draw a clear line, again, between feedback and the outcomes of the planning process. If you're doing community engagement and you're not doing, then it's really just, there's just no point. It's really just checking a box. So you have to be able to clearly draw the line. So this is documenting achievement, an example on both broad impact and collaborator demographics. So these are examples of work that we've done in other communities where, you know, because we had this digital hub that was tracking for us how many people we were impacting per day, how they were coming to the website, where they were coming from, we were able to clearly demonstrate and articulate how we achieved the quantitative goal that we set for broad impact at the onset of the project. And then leveraging untapped communities, you know, we again needed to track that using a demographic, you know, polling question, quick survey, quick poll framework throughout the process. And then we needed to measure that against the goals that we'd set at the onset of the project. So it's really important to set quantitative goals around that, and then use the digital tools at your disposal to document how you achieve those goals. And then also, this is something that I like to emphasize, and I see a lot of communities who've gone through planning processes never talk to their communities about, you know, all those public open houses that you guys went to. Where did all of our feedback go? What happened with that project? So firstly, expressing appreciation, you know, thanking your community for their time. If you can, we've had huge success with, if you do have community members who are more involved in the process, who are maybe like connectors to other community members or helping you reach untapped community members, paying them a stipend has really helped solidify the importance of their involvement and helped with some of that broad impact and goal achievement. Share how the community influenced the outcomes in the documentation on the plan. Don't just make the minutes and the attendance from your engagement work an appendix in the plan. Really demonstrate in the letter of the plan how the community influenced this work. Maintain digital presence. So I love this example from Rapid City. Rapid City has done such an amazing job in actually doing planning work and then implementing it. And they maintain this digital presence so people can check back and say, oh, you know, I provided feedback on that planning process last year. I wonder what happened with it. And you can also tick off, you know, little implementation successes that you've had over the planning process, so people know and can celebrate your successes with you. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. I'll see what's in there. I don't really see too much in there, but if you have questions, I will unmute everybody. And this is my contact information. If you have, if you want to, you know, gripe about your public engagement process, or you just want to chat with me about an upcoming engagement process that you'd like to discuss, I'm happy to speak with you about that. So thank you all for joining today, and now I will unmute and answer some questions.
Hi, I'm not sure. Hello?
Hi, I'm so sorry. I'm having a little trouble hearing you. So I'm going to pop up. I see some questions coming up. Any good tips? So this is from Lauren Simmons in Goldman. Hi, Lauren. Any good tips for creating visualization characters? There are some some web-based platforms, I think, that offer that you can buy a subscription to create the characters. I know we have one, and I am not a good person to ask this, but I do have a colleague, Bobby Mordenti, on the line, who's one of my amazing team members at Walker. Bobby, if you're there, can you answer this question?
Hey, Maya, can you hear me?
Bobby, we can hear you, but you're a little muffled. Can you move further from the microphone, maybe?
I'll get my headphones in. Is that better?
It's a little better, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we basically used, like Mallory had said, online subscriptions. I think what we have is freepick.com, and it's a yearly subscription, and it contains a lot of different vectors, graphics that you can modify if you do have somebody who has the capability to, create anything in Illustrator, any Adobe programs. So, and that's just one kind of resource. I know there's a bunch similar to that. That's just the one that we use, but very simple, and there's a lot of different options out there for you.
Awesome, thanks, Bobby. Lauren, I can follow up with you on that and give you some options. From Stephanie Ball, were the modules a combination of pre-recorded presentations and feedback opportunities? We actually didn't do pre-recorded presentations for the modules. What we did was, for this example, we were working with the City of Boulder. They have a really amazing staff team. What we did was we created a short presentation. So we had one module that was a PowerPoint and a mural exercise. So mural is sort of like an online Blackboard where people can collaborate on like a shared visualization. They can do post-its and drawings and all kinds of things. So the 30-minute option was like a brief presentation on an overview of the project, and then some feedback opportunities through mural. And then another one was on Mentimeter, and then we've just built the project background right in Mentimeter because it's a polling and a presentation tool. So we did a brief presentation on the project, and then we did some polling questions. And then we had instructions for staff. So in this case, we had like staff liaisons who were going out to different community organizations and doing these presentations. So we had really basic instructions, login information, how to use each of the tools, all of these types of things, so that they could easily kind of plug and play the modules. So it did require like a pretty hefty simplification of what we were planning to do, but it really allowed for massively increased participation just because we were not getting any traction on the virtual engagement community workshop series that we so ambitiously had created. Colton Burke, hi Colton, nice to see you. Kind of. We're trying to create an engagement infrastructure that will continue beyond the long range plan we're working on. Any types of ongoing engagement system. So I would say, like, I would start with this, this level of influence tool. Your version of this, like, this is something that I created, and there are other communities that do versions of this. The City of Boulder is an example that has like a public engagement framework, but this will help you kind of determine, okay, we're embarking on this type of project, so this is the level of influence the community has over the planning, the project outcomes. And so, like, if you let's say it's a shared vision exercise, these are the types of engagements and opportunities that we should give to people when we embark on this project. But I would start with kind of that framework, so you clearly understand that when you embark on a new planning project, you have sort of like a category and then a framework for how you engage the community in that instance. Chris Newbecker, when sending surveys, do you aim for the responses to resemble community makeup, demographics in terms of age, race, income, etc., or do you seek more responses from underrepresented groups? I think it depends on the planning process that you're working on. So I work in like the parking, mobility, and transportation space. Frequently, the type of work that we do involves user fees and user fee increases. So in those cases, I do like recommend trying to get more responses from communities that tend to be more heavily impacted by that. So renters and low-income people in the service sector. So I wouldn't just, sort of uniformly say that you should make sure that every time you send a survey, you're getting more representation from underrepresented groups, but I would clearly articulate who's going to be more heavily impacted from the planning process. And if people aren't being impacted equally, then I would try to set some measurable quantitative targets related to demographics around meeting the needs of those groups, so you do hear from them more. Or the I'm trying to read through the questions. Yes, you all can have copies of my slide deck. I'm more than happy to share it. It's from Scott Hun. Can you explain what you mean about being transparent about influence? So I think like one of the challenges I think we have with community engagement is when we think about community engagement, no matter what the planning work is, we as planners tend to think more is better. So we say, all right, well, the community isn't really influencing this work. Like they don't really have influence over the ultimate outcomes or decisions we make, but we still need to have them feel like they're part of the process. So we're going to have a lot of open houses where we ask them questions. We're going to have a community survey, etc. So instead of doing that, I would recommend being honest with yourselves about the level of influence that the community has and what is left to be decided. Again, like if you are already clear about the direction that you're heading with the project, I wouldn't ask a bunch of questions about what solutions people think should be brought to the fore, because you've already made a decision. So I think being honest with yourself about that and understanding like how that informs the engagement opportunities that you give to people, and then being really clear, like when you start a community meeting or you like put together a blurb to describe a survey, if the level of influence is minimal, you can say, we're specifically looking for feedback on X, Y, and Z, rather than giving people the false thought that they have significant influence over the direction that your community is going. What's your favorite tool for virtual breakout sessions? Any best practices on how to host a public meeting with small group discussions as part of the meeting? Yeah, so I really like Zoom. I think Zoom is personally my favorite platform for hosting public meetings. I think it's super intuitive for people. It's easy to share materials, and the breakout groups for Zoom it's really easy to implement. You can even, if you have a big group, it will automatically sort people, or you can choose which groups people can be in. So that's kind of my thought. I think if you're going to host a public meeting with breakout sessions, I would let people know up front and just have a staff member or team member in each breakout session to moderate, and just manage any potential technological difficulties that you might have, because you will have some. I've definitely had plenty of experience with it. How do you help decision makers become more comfortable with transparency? Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know if I have like a perfect answer. I think that's a hard question. I think just bringing decision makers, like for example, city, elected and appointed officials along in the process with you, doing some really good introductions to the project with elected and appointed officials, like building that into your project timeline, being really clear with elected and appointed officials about the scope of the project and what your proposed community engagement process is. And we've had a lot of success with like starting the project off with those, maybe even a study session with city council, and saying like, this is the scope of the project, this is what we're thinking for community engagement, and these are the specific like areas of influence and the questions that we have for the community. What have you all been hearing from the community? Like, what do you think this is an appropriate level of engagement? So you can kind of like start to get some buy-in from them on where you're heading with community engagement. But that's a hard question. I think it totally depends on the community, and I think also just letting them understand and kind of pulling them into the importance of establishing mutual benefit, like especially if like I keep using this example because it happens all the time in my work, that we are raising fees or trying to achieve a certain revenue goal, And so frequently, like, fees are raised, but there's no, like, dialogue with the community around what benefits that's resulted in for the community. So I think letting decision makers know that's a really important communication tool at their disposal will kind of help you along the way. There are a lot of questions. And feel free to jump off if you have to go. I will stay to answer all these questions. We talk about the tools in a digital format. How important does language and representation factor in when you develop the trust between administrators and the public? Dave, can you elaborate, if you're still here, can you elaborate on that question a bit? I'm not sure that I fully understand what you're asking.
Sure. So my name is Dave Sorrell. I'm the TDM manager over at UC Berkeley. And in the, I guess, 15 years I've done TDM in transit and planning, one of the biggest challenges for any administrator is gaining the trust of the public based on representation. It's usually based on the notion that, those that are in the planning profession have this this perceived ivory tower approach. And so the question comes from an area of, basically representation. Is it reflective of the community that they're serving? So if I, work at a college, having been, 13 years removed from my undergrad, like, does that make me just as effective, to understand what the challenges that my students are going through? And the language issue is also important, considering the fact that many of the communities may not have English as their first language. And so how do we address the gaps in, the digital outreach that we perform if we anticipate or acknowledge that there might be language challenges that might come up?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the representation question, this is such an important question. I think, like, the biggest challenge that I've had as a planner and working in the public engagement space is I assume that I can understand and empathize with everyone's perspective. And, like, I think that's not true, of course. And so, like, I always, when we put together materials for projects or for initiatives that we're working on, I think we sort of automatically understand it as like we think that it's digestible to the general public because we can understand it. So we've had a lot of successes with leveraging members of the community that actually represent those audiences. So community members, people who work in the service industries, people who speak English as a second language, people of color, people who frequently aren't represented in the planning process, and having them review our materials and tell us if they can understand it, if they feel represented in it. And then on the language side, I think it's really important to tailor your language offerings to the demographics in your community. So if you have a huge Nepal population or a Somali population, don't have everything in English and Spanish. Like, Spanish shouldn't be the default second language that you use. So really looking at your demographics. And I think in a digital space, that's actually much easier. So, like, all of our digital hub materials, we're able to pretty easily translate. Obviously, you should still leverage a professional translator, ideally someone who speaks the language that you're translating into as a first language, but I think that's actually been easier. For meetings, we found that, like, simultaneous translation is best, just as kind of like a logistical issue, or like having alternative offerings for folks who speak English as a second language, especially if you have multiple groups within your community who speak many different languages. I would not, generally, we haven't had success with translation services that occur after the English is spoken, or hosting completely separate meetings for folks that speak different languages. I think Dave left, but I liked his question. I hope others benefited from the answer. To determine that these marginalized groups were more impacted by these projects through surveys, by interviewing community leaders, these groups are often assumed to be more impacted by planning projects in general. Is there a particular methodology you use? We didn't really use a quantitative methodology or like detailed survey work to determine those groups in that case. I don't necessarily think it would be a bad idea, but based on kind of the institutional knowledge of the staff that we were working with at the City of Boulder, these groups were, so in terms of the untapped groups, and I like to use untapped rather than marginalized, just because I think like they have so much value. Like I think the word marginalized maybe diminishes it a little bit, but they were understood to be typically like just not engaged in planning processes, because the planning process, the ways that virtual engagement or community engagement was done in the past was not accessible to them for whatever reason. So I think we started with those groups, and then we did, just based on industry understanding of what groups are typically impacted by the planning work that we were doing, like ultimately the outcomes that we were looking towards what were updates to pricing approaches, updates to user fees. So we understood that lower income communities were more likely to be more cost sensitive and more have more day-to-day impacts based on those outcomes than others. How do you know what you know? In other words, it seems that a local government may think they know what the problem is already, but this could be far off from how the community feels. How important is it to challenge existing assumptions, and how do you initiate those conversations? So that's a really good question. I mean, I think if you have not had a pretty robust community engagement process around what the problem is, or if there is a documented understanding of what the problem is from the community's perspective, I would say it's important to ask questions that re-articulate the problem. And the way that I would do that is not, I think the best way to have like community members articulate the problem is through like a survey method, a quick poll method, so different layers of engagement methods that will allow the community to articulate the problem without inviting them to share massive amounts of grievances during an open house. I think also like using previous work from engagement processes and listening to and reading documentation from city council, town board meetings, commission meetings, etc., will help you kind of articulate the problem from the community's perspective. So while I think like part of it is of course collecting quantitative, objective data and analyzing that, but I think like it's important to understand how the problem is impacting folks. And I think the way you do that is A, looking at previous engagement processes where you've dealt with the problem, B, seeing where it's come up in kind of the day-to-day activity of the city, and C, maybe doing some user satisfaction kind of problem articulation work through like a survey or a polling tool. And then that's it. I think that's it for questions. Are there any more? Yes. You can get a copy of my presentation. Thank you all so much for your time, and thank you to the 19 people who stayed and listened to some of the responses. It's a pleasure talking about this topic. I would love to discuss it further with any of you who wish to discuss in greater detail. So thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Stay warm. It is very, very cold where I am. So, and be well.